Welcome back to our study on the book of Daniel. I hope you caught part 1 of our introduction to the book and also to the authorship debate. Today we'll be covering all of chapter 1, so let's dive right in. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. So Daniel's story begins during Jehoiakim's reign. He was the 17th of 19 kings of Judah from 609 to 598 BC, and you can read more about him in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. This one verse, though, has a lot of back history to it, so let's zoom out and rewind the clock a bit for a moment. When we look at our timeline, you can see Jehoiakim's reign highlighted in yellow on the left. This timeline helps us see the broad scope of the Old Testament history, but also the paralleled history of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires to the kingdom period. We can see as well our prophets laid out corresponding to whom they were prophesying to. So you see Joel, Isaiah, Nahum, Jeremiah, Ezekiel were to Judah, while Amos, Hosea, Micah, Zephaniah, Habakkuk were to the northern part of Israel. Jonah was to Nineveh. Then you have Daniel in Babylon, and Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi coming after the return from the Babylonian exile. Obadiah is a little bit of a mystery of where exactly or when exactly he wrote the book, but some put him after the temple destruction while have him a few centuries earlier, but it's no big deal. The broad outlook here is that God was sending prophets to everyone the entire time, mainly trying to get them to repent with a bunch of warning shots about their disobedience. But in the end, their failure to do so was on them. When we narrow the focus in on Daniel's period, you see Jeremiah and Ezekiel were contemporary prophets of him as well. And to get an idea of why Daniel and others were taken captive, you need to understand that there was a major shift in power taking place in the Near East from the Assyrians to the Babylonians during this time. Assyria was ridiculously powerful back then, up until about 627 BC, when King Ashurbanipal of Assyria died. The kings following him were considered very weak, and Nebuchadnezzar's dad, Nabopolassar, revolted and declared independence from the Assyrian Empire in 626, just after he was appointed king of Babylon by the next Assyrian king. Many battles between the Assyrians and Babylonians took place for the next 15 years, but the big deciding one that took place in 612 was with the Battle of Nineveh. At this point, you can see the division of the kingdoms here, and in 612, the joined forces of Babylon and Media defeated the Assyrians at Nineveh. 3 years later, in 609 BC, King Necho of Egypt got himself into the game here. We read the following in 2 Chronicles. After all this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, Necho, king of Egypt, came up to fight against Carchemish by the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. But he, Necho, sent ambassadors to Josiah, saying, What have I to do with thee, thou king of Judah? I come not against thee this day, but against the house wherewith I have war. For God commanded me to make haste, forbear thee from meddling with God, who is with me, that he destroy thee not. Nevertheless, Josiah would not turn his face from him, but disguised himself, that he might fight with him, and hearkened not unto the words of Necho from the mouth of God, and came to fight in the valley of Megiddo. And the archers shot at King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, Have me away, for I am sorely wounded. And his servants therefore took him out of that chariot, and put him in the second chariot that he had, and they brought him into Jerusalem, and he died, and was buried in one of the sepulchres of his fathers. And all of Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. Now Josiah's death connects us right to Daniel 1:1, because it says, following Josiah's death, that then the people of the land took Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, and made him king in his father's stead. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. And the king of Egypt put him down at Jerusalem, and condemned the land in 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. So they were having to pay a tax. And the king of Egypt made Eliakim, his brother, king over Judah and Jerusalem, and turned his name to Jehoiakim. And Necho took Jehoahaz, his brother, and carried him to Egypt. So at this point, Jehoiakim is a vassal ruler to Necho of Egypt. And you see the renaming process from Eliakim to Jehoiakim, which was a power play and a reminder by rulers to let the people know that they are no longer truly free, but really servants to a foreign nation. Now, for the next 3 years, Jehoiakim is a vassal to Egypt, but then in 605 BC, Necho marches north to help the Assyrians fight against the Medes and the Babylonians, because ultimately Necho wants to rule the whole Middle East. Controlling the trade routes ensures financial prosperity for your nation by tariffing others and collecting annual tribute. Which is why this drives Nebuchadnezzar to Carchemish as well to meet him head on. So from 612 to 605 BC, you have 7 years of fighting on of who is going to become the next superpower of the Middle East. This would be very similar to the fight for the European domination in the world wars. Nebuchadnezzar ultimately wins at Carchemish and is named king after his father died in the same year. He starts to move south to drive the Egyptians back, but along the way puts various sieges on multiple sites, and in his path he goes right to the front door of Jehoiakim in Jerusalem. So after wiping the table with everybody, this is when our main character Daniel appears on the biblical scene with Nebuchadnezzar, taking him back, and many others, to Babylon as captives. So other than a bunch of head knowledge, how does this actually serve us? Well, first we get a broader idea of actually what's going on here. It wasn't just simply, Nebuchadnezzar came to town, sieged Jerusalem, and then just took Daniel and a few others back to Babylon. No, there's a big Middle Eastern war that's going on right now. Second, you see that biblical history and Near East history are interlocked with one another. So anyone who tries to divorce ancient Near East history away from the Bible is only doing it based upon their preconceived biases. Third, this actually helps you refute Jehovah's Witnesses. How so? Well, they believe that Jesus returned in 1914, invisibly. Yes, I understand. Invisibly, how could you possibly know? I get it. But they've actually held their flag pretty hard to that date. And the reason for it is actually predicated upon this time period that we're talking about here. They believe that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple actually happened in 607 BC, 20 years before what every single scholar, chronologist, and current history book says that it actually happened in 587-86 BC. But obviously, everything we just showed before and after 607 had nothing to do with the destruction of Jerusalem or the temple. So even though the entire academic planet agrees that it happened in 587-86 BC, you might just ask, why don't they just say that it happened 20 years later? What's the big deal? Well, it's one of those big failed prophecies thing that they have to deal with. And they said in 1914 that Jesus kicked Satan out of heaven, and that's what jump-started World War I, and that's why, we've had all the problems in the 20th century, because Satan's down here now causing a bunch of pandemonium. Yes, you can read this in their Good News translation, or their Good News, from God pamphlets that they hand out. Now, with the advent of World War I, they said that, hey, the whole world is coming to an end, Armageddon's upon us, and, hey, people are flooding in now because it seems like these guys have actually probably figured it out. Man, they're going to blow up the whole world, aren't they? Yeah, okay, so Jehovah's Witnesses are kind of on the rise at this point. So, with a good dose of fear, they then said that God looked down on earth and chose them in 1919 to be his sole organization of whom he approves to be true and faithful witnesses. Yes, they say organization and not church. It's a big thing to them. But how did they prove that 1914 actually was the correct date? This was done by taking the tribulation period that's in Revelation that says that it will last 2,520 days, and with a day-year interpretation, meaning that one day equals 1 year, that 2,520 years ago from 1914, you get 607 BC because you have to subtract one more year because there's no year zero. And with that, that's the time when the times of the Gentiles began. And they say, well, that's got to be the destruction of Jerusalem then. And everyone else is wrong. Well, this is probably part of the reason why they don't want their people attending college either, because every history book would refute them the minute they go into 101 world history course. But enough of that. if you do come across Jehovah Witnesses, now you know you can easily refute them with that 1914 thing with just simply like, look, nobody says 607. Everyone says 587. So on to verse 2. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, Solomon's temple, which he carried into the land of Shinar, Babylon, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. One passing note here is that Daniel recognized that God ultimately allowed for Nebuchadnezzar's success to take place. But from an Israelite perspective, they might have seen this as God abandoning them, but in all reality it was just part of God's discipline plan for their idolatry, with a desire to bring them back into obedience. And we see that Nebuchadnezzar takes the temple vessels and puts them into the temple of his god, and this could be the god Baal, Marduk, or maybe another one. But the important ancient thought here is that Nebuchadnezzar sees this ultimately as his God just defeated Israel's God, Yahweh. So this isn't merely taking the traveling trophies back to their home gym and putting them in their trophy case. This is a spiritual declaration saying that our God is mightier and greater than your God, Yahweh. People in that time saw the result of wars as the gods battling in the background, which meant that whose God won determined who won on the ground. And in the coming chapters, though, we will see the Lord teaching Nebuchadnezzar a first-hand lesson on this about truly who is the most powerful God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and the princes, the children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. First thing to note is that Daniel is described as a child, or you might read in other versions, a youth. Next is that in verse 5 you see that they would be trained for 3 years. So Daniel and his friends are going to be fully educated in everything that the Babylonians have available for them to learn. This type of education is very similar to the one that Moses would have been having under Pharaoh's house, knowing all Egyptian customs, language, and political affairs. This process is actually attested to by both Plato and Xenophon in their works about youth around in their teen years were being educated and trained to serve the king following their quote-unquote graduation. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So here we see our 4 youths' names being changed to similar as was Eliakim being renamed to Jehoiakim by Pharaoh Necho of Egypt. One of the things that we can tell here is that names meant a little bit more back in the ancient world. People just didn't name their kids based upon cuteness, but it was actually tied to their culture's identity and ultimately to which gods they were serving. And this should make sense because we remember that God changed Abraham and Sarah's name from Abram and Sarai into Abraham and Sarah by inserting part of his name into theirs, which meant that they were now serving him instead of any other pagan god. So when we have the Babylonians changing the names of our 4 friends here, we have Daniel meaning God is my judge, to Belteshazzar that means Bel protect his life. So you can see how the Babylonians are trying to ingrain it into the young captive that he is no longer a servant of Yahweh, but now the Babylonian pagan god Bel or Baal. Hananiah means beloved of the Lord, which is changed to Shadrach, meaning illumined by the sun god. Mishael means who or what is like God, to Meshach, meaning who is like the moon god. And Azariah means the Lord is my help, and when changed to Abednego means servant of Nego. What's interesting about this is that in the Istanbul Museum, there actually is a prism of Nebuchadnezzar's that has 3 names on it: Hananu, Mishael, and Marduk, and Arti Nabu. Could these 3 names be Daniel's friends? We can't really say for sure, but if you look at the names, you can tell there's a lot of similarity and the roles that are attached to them. Now, if you think about their situation here for a moment, we have 4 teenagers that just got dragged 1,000 miles away from their home and family, and they're now into a foreign country, people speaking differently, acting differently, worshiping a bunch of pagan gods, and in their mind, they're just like, now we have to go by new names, and they have to learn how to serve their own kidnappers. So really the question here is, how would you expect their resolve to be to continue to worship God in this state? Or really the question is, how would yours be? Well, let's see what they did. But, there's a good word, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, as we see God's sovereignty over the events that are taking place here in the whole book, we also see Daniel and his friends are personally committing to remaining faithful to God. They didn't throw the towel in on God just because of their undesired circumstances. And in response to their faithfulness, verse 9 says, "Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs." So, can we completely say that God was 100% sovereign over this situation? Yes. But did Daniel and his friends choose to remain faithful and obedient to Yahweh? Yes. And this idea is actually shared from Paul to Timothy in his first letter. "According to the glorious gospel of the blessed God, which was committed to my trust, I thank Jesus Christ our Lord, who hath enabled me, for that he counted me faithful, putting me into the ministry." Although it is obvious that God chose and saved Paul by revealing himself to Paul on the road to Damascus, the point that Paul is indicating here is that he is trustworthy and faithful for the ministry that God chose him for. "And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king." The leader of the eunuchs understands one thing here. His life is on the line with this. He won't simply be fired and go look for another job. It will be off with his head if these boys come out looking too thin and sick in front of the king. So his neck is literally on the line here. Then Daniel said to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse, or vegetables, to eat, and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants." So he consented to let them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. Now there is a whole lot of trust and faith going on here on both sides. Both of them realize that their lives are on the line over a 10-day diet plan. Most people won't even eat healthy for 10 days, even though it's really better for them. But here, we have teenagers refusing to eat the king's food because likely it's, considered unclean because it was sacrificed to pagan gods and they don't want to violate the Mosaic law. They would rather risk their lives than take the king's food, which without a doubt was probably the best possible meal they could have in all the land. And the other thing to notice here is that they asked for 10 days. It sounds a little too specific, but there's probably a theological point behind it. If you look up tens in Scripture, you would note that there was 10 plagues of Egypt, 10 commandments, 10 times Israel complained to God in the wilderness, 10 days here by Daniel, and 10 days in Revelation 2 to the church of Smyrna to wait it out in prison. The theme here behind this idea is testimony, that God's testimony is on display when the number 10 is in play. And if you were to look up other biblical numbers or numerology, you would see that many numbers consistently relate to other themes as well. So when you come across numbers while reading, you know that there's a little bit more to the meaning of the text that's taking place here. "And at the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat." So the boys' diet plan worked, and didn't become sick looking either. Thus Melsar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them vegetables or pulse to eat. And as for the 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So their faithfulness turned into spiritual blessings from God. But as we know, this didn't mean that their faith wouldn't be put to the test again down the road. Now at the end of the days, that the king had said he should bring them in. Then the prince of the eunuchs brought them before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them was all none found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding, that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and the astrologers that were in his realm. So we see the boys have graduated from Babylon High, and that they have been moved up to the top positions in the court of serving Nebuchadnezzar. Were the boys blessed by their faithfulness and dedication to God? Yes. Was God still there making sure that his divine plan be worked out to fruition? Yes. And the chapter ends saying, "And Daniel continued even unto the 1st year of King Cyrus." This meant that Daniel remains in this position for the next 65 years into his old age, which is another indicator that Daniel was correctly described as being a youth or a teenager here in chapter 1. So what's the big takeaway here in chapter 1? Well, let's ask some review questions. Did God bring judgment upon Judah and Jehoiakim for their wickedness? Yes. But did God use that judgment to orchestrate the conditions for Daniel and his friends to remain safe and ultimately to be groomed to sit next to the most powerful man in the world at that time as just use? Yes. And yet, within that tapestry of God's sovereignty being played out, we see Jehoiakim being judged for his own actions and Daniel being rewarded for his faithfulness. Knowing that this type of relationship takes place between God and men is why we can say that Paul declared in Romans 8:28 that, "And we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose." Because if God is for us, who can be against us? Reminder, hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. In the meantime, stay salty.